$5 billion to manufacture and distribute their COVID vaccine, allowing this vaccine to be provided free for the American people.
Hello, everybody.
While Democrats were pursuing a highly divisive and entirely baseless impeachment endeavor as far back as January 13th, this president, the Trump administration, and the National Institute of Health was partnering with Moderna and working on this vaccine for the American people. But that's not all. This administration has remained engaged on the development and distribution of a safe and effective vaccine throughout the year. Began in January and continued thereafter. On May 15th, Operation Warp Speed was launched. On September 16th, we released 2 documents outlining a strategy to deliver a safe and effective vaccine. These documents were the strategic distribution overview and the interim playbook for state, tribal, territorial, and local health programs and partners. On September 23rd, we provided $200 million to jurisdictions to support plans for eventual distribution. On October 14th, we provided $31 million to Sitvia for vaccine-related consumable products. On October 16th, we made agreements with CVS and Walgreens to administer vaccines to residents of long-term care facilities. On October 21st, under the PrEP Act, we issued guidance authorizing qualified pharmacy technicians to administer the vaccine. On October 30th, we announced that McKesson Corporation will produce, store, and distribute vaccine ancillary supply kits on behalf of the Strategic National Stockpile to help healthcare workers who will administer the vaccines. And on November 12th, we announced the partnership with large chain pharmacies and independent regional ones to deliver safe and effective vaccines. The unprecedented response to this pandemic has already saved many American lives. And as you can see, this timeline was ongoing. This was a long process and one that we are very proud of. Now, with multiple safe and effective vaccines just around the corner, we urge all Americans to wash your hands, socially distance, wear a mask when you cannot do so. And with that, I'll take questions. Kevin.
Kayleigh, thanks. I'm going to ask you a question that I'm asked fairly often away from the White House, and that is with respect to what Rudy Giuliani and the legal team on the campaign side had to say yesterday. People asked, let's suggest that, yes, there is evidence of fraud, irregularities, even malicious intent with respect to vote totals. The question is, what then would be the pathway or strategy to overturn what the campaign believes is a flawed election? Are we talking about a judicial pathway? Are we talking about a legislative pathway? And a follow-up, how soon might Americans be able to get their hands
like
on
any line
vaccine?
of reasoning, or
Yeah,
she's just going to go all over the place?
Your first point, I would say
she's got it written down.
there's been multiple pieces of
I
litigation
have my lies
filed
all right
across the
here.
country by various individuals, the campaign and others. I will leave it to the campaign to make those determinations as to how to proceed. But the president's been very clear. He wants every legal vote to be counted and to make sure no illegal votes are counted. But with regard to a vaccine, we believe that there will be 40 million doses available by the end of the year. Again, this is extraordinary. This is the fastest vaccine in history by fivefold. It's really extraordinary progress. You've heard Dr. Fauci, among others, say that, and it was only made possible because of this president who said at the same time I'm pursuing a vaccine, I'm going to do something novel. I'm going to manufacture it. Many American lives will be saved thanks to President Trump and the great work of Operation Warp Speed.
Can I follow up one more? Just one thing about the COVID vaccine. Is there a concern inside the White House that a lack of working with potential or presumptive President-elect Biden team will somehow slow down the distribution of the COVID vaccine?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question. It's an important one, and not in the slightest, because in fact I did hear the former vice president say yesterday he was concerned about not being able to distribute a vaccine. He shouldn't be. Maybe he hasn't seen, but we have publicly available that plan that I mentioned in my opening. It's the COVID-19
former vice president, president-elect,
playbook for jurisdiction.
President-elect Kayleigh.
This is publicly available.
Get your shit straight.
The president would like to read through it.
Jesus.
Beyond that, I would say that we've already, going back months, partnered with the 64 jurisdictions
Oh my God.
In this country to make sure that they each had
New setup here.
individualized distribution plans. Those have been assessed. Those have been made certain that they're good and operational. So this work has been ongoing. There's a distribution plan in place, which is why you heard General Perna say yesterday that within 24 hours of getting that EUA, the emergency use authorization, we will be able to distribute
Yeah,
this
sorry,
all across the
ACP.
country.
When are you going to admit you lost?
Yes, Kevin? Yeah. Sorry, Mario.
Okay. Thanks, Kayleigh. What is the president planning to discuss this afternoon with the two
that?
Michigan lawmakers?
That's
and
the,
we asked them
Playboy
to
reporter.
have the state legislature appoint electors.
Guy who got into it
will
with,
support his reelection. What's the nature of that meeting?
So he will
Trump's
be meeting
lackeys
later on.
in the White House,
This is not an
lawn.
advocacy meeting. There will be no one from the campaign there. He routinely meets with lawmakers from all across the country.
When will you admit you lost the election?
Kayleigh, at what point does the president concede the race?
Love it. He's yelling, when will you admit you lost the election?
So right now there's ongoing litigation. There
Awesome.
are, what we know, 74 million Americans that voted for this president. That's more votes than any president has gotten in history. It's really extraordinary, and there are very real claims out there that the campaign is pursuing. 234 pages of affidavits publicly available in one county alone. That's Wayne County, and 2 individuals on the canvassing board there that have declined to certify. So these are real claims. These individuals deserve to be heard. This was a system that had never been tried in American history, mass mail-out voting. It's one that we have identified as being particularly prone to fraud, so those claims deserve to be pursued.
Has anyone from the White House spoken with GSA, with the director of GSA, about the timing of ascertaining who the next president will be, and has any pressure been applied to her?
Absolutely not. GSA will make the determination of ascertainment at the right moment. Right now, there's a constitutional process that's being played out. There are questions being asked in court, but the GSA will determine when ascertainment is reached.
Can I just ask one other question, which is Senator Lamar Alexander today has put out a statement encouraging the Trump administration, in the absence of ascertainment, to begin allowing the Biden team full access to everything they need for a transition, access to agencies, access to real-time data. What's the harm in doing that?
So there's a Presidential Transition Act that determines exactly what an administration needs to do in advance of an election, and we have done everything statutorily required, and we will continue to do that.
It's after the election now.
Thank you. I have a question first, a follow-up on the transition. Has the president or anyone in the administration instructed officials not to engage or have conversations with members of the Biden transition team?
No, I've certainly never been instructed that. I've never heard of an instruction to that end.
Okay, and my second question is about COVID, because yesterday, a lot of what we heard from the doctors, they've been saying since the end of March. Back then, the projections were that 100,000 Americans would die. Now, as you know, we've surpassed that by 2.5 times. Did the administration fail to communicate how serious this threat was to the American people? Or how else do you explain what went wrong?
Look, I would say the initial projection that our doctors gave us was 2 million people that would lose their lives. And it's a tragedy anytime one life is lost.
Coward.
We are far below the 2
Outward.
million that this could have been. We took
Cowardly
very
answers.
aggressive measures at the beginning of this.
We
with the
did. We
China
didn't do
travel
anything
ban,
wrong.
creating the greatest
we didn't
testing
do anything
system in
wrong.
the entire world. Therapeutics, the fact that we have 6 working therapeutics right now, the fact that we continue to identify more and more, the fact that I believe we have a chart on this, a fatality chart. It's deaths by 100 for age and month. And as you can see, deaths have come down for every age group. And for those over 70, that line, that red line, is a testament to what this president has done. Therapeutics, monoclonal antibodies, that is a recent one, that reduces hospitalization in high-risk seniors with moderate to mild COVID by 70%. That's American ingenuity rising to the occasion, and President Trump oversaw all of this. But, of course, we are seeing cases rise, and it's very important. Wash your hands.
Do you guys
socially
see
distance. We're taking this
the
seriously.
asterisk down at the bottom there?
Messaging contributed to that, because just
This
this
might
week,
not
for
be-
example,
the count
yesterday,
November might not
Vice
be
President
full.
Pence wanted to make clear that they
This is
supported
incomplete data, but
state and local
it shows that it's
decision-making.
low.
just 2 days ago, you called some of those state guidelines Orwellian. So how do you expect people to know what to do with all this mixed messaging?
Well, two things can happen at once, and it's this: taking COVID seriously, engaging in aggressive mitigation, but also recognizing that the American people have certain freedoms. And it is, by definition, Orwellian for a state like Oregon to say, if you have more than 6 people in your family congregate,
We're gonna come and we're gonna.
we can jail
The
you.
police
for
are gonna
30
come.
days. That's not the American way.
you're
The
so
American
bogus.
people, know the CDC recommendations, know the guidelines. We've been talking about this for 10 months, but the American people still have certain freedoms, still have autonomy, and still can make important self-responsibility decisions themselves. Yes, Deborah.
Thank you, Kayleigh.
No, but
Nice to
see,
you.
Kayleigh, they can't, especially when you're calling regulations, restrictions Orwellian. You're encouraging them, and Scott Atlas, the guy who's leading this task force now, apparently, which he wasn't even in yesterday's press briefing, like, when you call this stuff Orwellian, when you encourage people to rise up, like, you can't trust people to make their own decisions, girl, because you're feeding them misinformation.
Last night, Tucker Carlson said that campaign
this is so
attorneys
terrible. I'm so ready for this thing to be
failed
over.
provide evidence for
Oh,
her
Donald Trump,
assertion
Kayleigh.
about communist money in the 2020 election. And Byron York, another journalist who's been very fair to this White House, said that it was a turning point, Rudy Giuliani and the conduct at that press conference, where Republicans were feeling that that the legal maneuvers just aren't working. So, did you all have a reaction to that when you saw that and read about it?
Again, that would be a question for the campaign. We at the White House are aggressively working on COVID, winding down the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, among other issues. There will be a drug pricing announcement later in the afternoon as well.
Okay, since
Yes.
I'm the pooler, could I ask a question for Jackson Richmond of the Jewish News Syndicate, who couldn't be here because
Yes.
of social distancing? And his question is about Jonathan Pollard. His parole conditions are set to expire tomorrow. Is the president willing to commute his parole conditions or pardon him if the DOJ extends Pollard's parole? Have you been getting any calls from the Jewish and pro-Israel community to take action on this case?
I haven't heard about that. I haven't looked into the particular case, but if he shoots me an email, we'll take a look at his question.
Thank you.
Yes.
So back to the topic of concession, like we said earlier, is there something that the president needs to see before making that call? Is it the end of these lawsuits, whenever they do wrap up, all of them, states certifying results or different counties, or December 14th when the Electoral College casts its ballots?
Look, the president, again, is pursuing ongoing litigation, taking it day by day, and we'll wait for that litigation to play out.
So just to clarify, it's the end of that litigation that we would need to see before getting a call?
There's an entire constitutional process of electors casting their ballots, and I will leave that to the president. Yes. Chanel.
Thank you, Kayleigh. Contrary to the court of media opinion, there is real-time data showing
What a joke.
vast irregularities in the voting
Oh,
system.
look at
that
her.
have been
Oh
in the
my
last few
God.
weeks.
What is she?
I asked this question at the campaign.
What is she
I asked this
wearing?
now, the White
You
House.
look ridiculous,
Where
you
is our
moron.
FBI in this entire scheme? Are they looking at any of the evidence that this White House or the campaign
Rockin'
have
fur in the
presented
White House.
in terms of
What an
real-time
embarrassment.
data evidence of voter irregularities?
Oh, this
Where
is Chanel something
Yeah,
from,
you're
I think
right
she's
with
from
regards to
OAN,
the FBI,
I think.
on
Just
that, to the DOJ.
a complete
on that.
stooge.
Spoken with the FBI
Oh.
in the last 3 weeks.
Not that I'm
Yeah,
aware
Los Ojos, you
of,
saw that. Of
but
course you did.
Look, I would say that there are real
Hablo
questions on
español.
mass mail-out voting. We have put those questions forward, and we've said this for the better part of a year. There was a bipartisan commission that talked about and identified the real potential for fraud with mass mail-in voting. Also, something that I would note is just we talked a lot about transfer of power
Phoenix,
and election, and it's worth remembering that this president was never given an orderly transition of power. His presidency was never accepted. In fact, before
Oh, I love it. He's calling her out.
Hurricane was launched by
Oh, that's a
Peter Strzok
lie.
to pursue a baseless
Yes,
allegations
dude.
about the president's
Yes.
ties with Russia. That's before he was president.
Oh,
trying to
how
subvert
awesome
the
is
will of the
that?
American people. We know in August, Peter Strzok wrote a text message about an insurance policy against a
Oh my
Trump
God.
presidency, once again trying to silence the voice of the American people.
What's
In
that guy's name?
2016,
Brian?
In October, that there was
Brian
a FISA
something, right? I
warrant,
think.
a FISA warrant taken out to spy on the Trump campaign. Then the American people spoke, and they spoke
Because
commandingly
y'all were working
and
with
elected President
Russians.
Trump, despite all of
You
the
were trying to
odds.
undermine our
And what
democracy
happened after he
since
was
day
elected?
one.
You had 70 lawmakers say we're not coming to his inauguration. Democratic lawmakers.
Yeah, Brian-
You had Elizabeth Warren
Brian
saying
Karem?
we're going to attempt to obstruct the Trump transition by
Brian
urging
Karem.
the Government Accountability Office to investigate the incoming Trump transition. In January of that year, you had President Obama
Awesome.
have a by-the-book meeting. where they
Everyone
talked
is
about
mean
the
to us.
Logan Act, using that
Everyone
act to
didn't
go
want us
after
to be the
Lieutenant General Michael
president.
Flynn. Just before the inauguration, you had BuzzFeed promoting and publishing this bogus Steele dossier that's been widely debunked. And then for 2 years, you had the basis Mueller investigation, which searched for collusion, found none, and exonerated President Trump. While in 2016, President Trump became the duly elected president, many sought to undermine him, discredit him, delegitimize him, and deny his victory. There were no calls for unity. There were no calls for healing. So while every legal vote is counted, let us not forget...
This is
the
usually her
peaceful
wrap-up speech,
transition,
right?
or lack thereof, that President Trump had
They
to
were so
endure
mean
in
to us.
2016 and 4 years into his presidency. Thank you, everyone, for the
That's
very
it.
good
Bye.
and substantive questions.
Show.
I don't call an activist.
I'm not an activist, and you've been taking questions since October 1st, and you just took...
I don't call it activists.
What an embarrassment. What an embarrassment. Oh, what a joke. Oh, God, that was so disgusting. I mean, you know, I knew it was going to be bad. I didn't think it was going to be. I mean, how long have we been streaming for? What, like 20 minutes? 19 minutes? Yeah, Los Ojos, of course she runs away. Of course she runs away. Of course Mike Pence ran away yesterday, right? They're little rats. They're little rats. Somebody asked a question like, what's in it for her? Why is she doing this? Look, they have, just like Mike Pompeo the other day, right? Saying, oh, there's going to be a peaceful transition to a Donald Trump second term. The reason they have to say that is because all these people are going to work in the private sector after this for like really shady companies, right? Companies who they're going to have to like give loyalty pledges to. And so they're having to like prove, right, that they're ride or die, right? That they'll go down with the sinking ship if they have to. It's just, this is just a nightmare scenario, right? Like this is exactly what our government was set up to prevent. And that's like being loyal to the executive and only the executive and not like not the country, right? And so now we're seeing how just disgusting that can be. Like, oh, I knew this press briefing was going to be bad. I didn't think it was going to be. I had no idea that Brian Karem was going to go off like that. How awesome was that? Oh, Brian Karem, dude. Like you're speaking for, you know, for all of us who are like, who've seen the political correctness just get tossed aside by Republicans over the decades, right? From you lie, being yelled at Barack Obama, to the birtherism, to their denial of climate change, to Donald Trump and just being a disgusting, gross pig. He's just over it. He's fed up with this administration, right? With Kayleigh McEnany, like the liar that she is. Donald Trump lies. Like, good for Brian Karem. Like, he's the news story, which is good. He's the news story of him calling out, that's a lie, right? Like, when are you gonna say that he lost? When are you gonna accept that he lost? I think that was him. Oh man, what a great press briefing for Brian Karem. Oh, so Donald is gonna come on in, geez, when is he coming? What time is that stream? I scheduled that stream for a little later. So yeah, thank you guys for liking the video. I'm just checking out the dashboard now. You guys are awesome. That's a bunch of likes. So yeah, I'm just gonna like go through our comments real quick. ACP, good to see you, man. Phoenix is in here. Mr. Pador is in here. I saw some comments from him. Yeah. Los Ojos, welcome. Karen, welcome. Wolf, welcome. LG, welcome. Mark LaPrade. Jasmine. Val, I'm back. Cool. So, yeah, Anthony Ward. Trump wants them to humiliate themselves publicly to prove their loyalty. Yeah, I mean, it sure is embarrassing what they're doing. I think some of them actually they believe this nonsense. I think they think that they're, they've put themselves in this bubble where they think that, yeah, like, no, we're fighting for the American people. I mean, Kayleigh might be so blinded, right, with just sifting through all of the bullshit that she sifted through over the years. I mean, yeah, I think she's. I think a couple of them are just straight up blinded, and they're just willing to toe the party line. And also, I mean, but really, I really think it's just if any of you guys have seen The Wire, just follow the money, right? It's all about the money. It's all about like the next few years for these guys. They're all going to work in the private sector, and they all have to prove that that they'll hold water, hold the water for a crappy company, because only shitty, corrupt companies are going to be trying to get these guys, because they're going to go, oh man, like they're going to be loyal, right? That's what this is all about. This is all about the Benjamins, baby. A10 Warthog. Fake news, mad again. The true patriots see through their lies. I don't know who you're referring to, but yeah, maybe you want to clarify that. Be a fly on the wall in Pence's head. Yeah. Oh my God. I know the stories, guys, that are going to come out over the next few years are. Yeah. ACP, thanks for encouraging people to join the channel. If you guys, if you guys are new to the channel, you guys can subscribe and like this video. That's like just an awesome thing to do, and a great way to just be a part of the channel. And then you can also become a member for a couple bucks a month, or you can check out my merch store, teespring.com/reflect-gear. I have the merchandise on the way to me, some of the samples, so I'm going to be rocking that in videos. I think it looks pretty cool. Pretty simple stuff, but I think it looks cool. Mr. Padur, good point, man. I think we should help Trump, who's on his way to oblivion, by ignoring him. Then he can get used to it little by little. Yeah, I think it's important to pick and choose our battles here over the next couple months, because like broadcasting, live streams like this, if Brian Karem wouldn't have been yelling and screaming those things at her, like basically calling her out on her bullshit, then I probably would have been like really upset with myself that I broadcast this, because it's just, Kayleigh McEnany lying. And so that's why I wanted to come on and be here to call her out when I could. So yeah, I mean, like back to Padur, right now they're really dangerous, right? This administration is really dangerous because they're trying to sell off Alaskan Arctic wildlife, portions of Alaska to big oil so that they can drill. He's trying to weaken our positioning in the Middle East by withdrawing troops, and military leaders are saying, look, like that's just not a good idea. He wants to bomb Iran. The Secretary of Treasury, Steve Mnuchin, announced today that he wants to withdraw, basically get rid of government subsidies for like the poor, people who are being like most affected by this pandemic. Like they're doing everything they can to try to make our world and make life for Joe Biden just harder. So they're screwing they're screwing around big time. So like now is a really important time to like keep an eye on them. But I understand your feeling of like, hey man, like just ignore the idiot and let him go do his thing. I get it. Yeah. Midnight Man, welcome in. It's unfortunate so many weak-minded people just follow the lies and misinformation. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a number of things, right? It's that conservative bubble that they fall into where if they tell them something, if Donald Trump or Kayleigh McEnany tell them something, then they make sure that that conservative bubble like parrots it, right? And so if they do go to do their research, well, they're doing it in a conservative bubble where it's going to reinforce what Donald Trump is lying about, right? It's going to reinforce Donald Trump's lies. Yeah, Anthony Ward, worry about the electors. Yeah, so there have been a few articles that have come out over the past couple days, essentially saying that the electors have already they've already agreed to send in the electors for the popular vote. So there's really no turning back on that. I mean, it's just kind of funny. It's exactly what happened in Michigan, right? Where you have these people agree to something, and then once it's not going their way, it's oh sorry guys. Oh cool, yeah, you guys can see the inside of the analytics. That's cool. Yeah, so yeah, they're just these people are they're so in the moment, right? They don't, like, Donald Trump isn't considering how authoritarians in the future are going to like learn lessons from this, right? Because Donald Trump is like, he's doing it like Donald Trump is he's that idiot authoritarian who's like, all right, I'm just going to put my head down and just like run through the walls, right? Because I mean, he's just every day he's just like trying to run through like the walls of democracy, and eventually his momentum will stop, right? And it's not going to be on January 20th. He's going to continue, right? This whole charade, this whole, it was stolen, it was a fraud. He'll never accept that he lost this election. What that's going to do is that's going to, all of these other authoritarians who have been boxed in by our, democratic principles, they're going to go, oh, like Donald Trump like paved this way here. We see where he ran out of momentum. This is how we're going to do it differently, and this is how we're going to get further. And what I'm afraid of, and I mean it's true, is that those walls, right, the barriers, they end at a certain point. And so Donald Trump may not get all the way through them, but it's really hard to get all the way through them. But just like anything, like there is an end, and could another authoritarian down the line, whether it's in 4 years, whether it's in 8 years, whether it's in 80 years, right? Could they, break through that and destroy our democracy? That's essentially the fear that, political analysts have, and historians have as well, is that, this thing is fragile and it can be broken. We've seen it in history, not in our history, but certainly in history. Los Ojos talking about Kayleigh's husband. I don't know much about him. If you want to fill us in on what's going on with that. Yeah, and what a crappy way to like end the press briefing. It's just, you're all activists, you're all against us. It was, even before the election, they were opening FISA warrants. It's like, Kayleigh, man, like, you don't want to remind people of that. Like, that's how people, your campaign, there are people in prison right now because they messed around with Russians and lied to the FBI about it. Like, you don't like that's not a good look for you. That is not a good look for you. Phoenix giving us a history lesson. I like it. Yeah, Anthony, I'm all about holding this guy responsible, and that's kind of the conversation that we really need to be having is what is Joe Biden going to do? I'm hoping that the FBI is going to take care of things because of the investigations that the Manhattan DA is considering against Trump. And I hope the FBI is gonna be there and support that, because it's gonna be a new day with a new without Bill Barr. And again, that goes back to that is why we're seeing Donald Trump talk about this and try to describe the election as a fraud, is because he thinks that's going to help him evade prison time in the next few years. And I think again, it goes back to the Russians. Is he going to move to Russia to evade that, to escape prison time? He very well could. He very well could. But if he doesn't, this is part of that, right? This is, I'm going to try to build up so much anti-government resentment, so much government resentment that it's going to be harder for them to bring charges against me and my family. I mean, I don't really think he cares about his kids. I think it's all about him. Izzy Phoenix. Okay, cool. Let's go to Joe. Whew. That was yesterday's. Could watch. Tune in, ascertainment briefing. I think this is Bob Bauer. Yeah, this is with Oh no, wait. Here we go. Tune in for updates. Yeah, I think this might be. I don't know if Joe's gonna appear on this. Let's see what we got here.
And convene them at this time, and when we need people to come from
her
all
name
sides
is,
to come
what's
together
her
and
name?
address the crises
Jen
we're
Psaki.
facing. On Tuesday, the president-elect and the vice president-elect met with some of the country's most experienced national security experts about the challenges facing our country and our institutions, including the diplomatic, defense, and intelligence challenges the administration will inherit on day one. And just as a reminder, these are meetings that, of course, he would probably have anyway. These are people, many of them he's known for decades throughout his time and career working on foreign policy issues. But right now, he is being shut out, and the administration is being shut out of intelligence briefings and national security briefings that provide real-time information, threat assessments, data about the threats we're facing around the world, our engagements around the world, and information we need to get the pandemic under control. On Wednesday, the president-elect met with frontline workers, hearing firsthand accounts from healthcare workers and first responders who are bearing the high emotional toll of helping others recover from COVID. And just yesterday, the president-elect and the vice president-elect met with Democratic and Republican governors from the National Governors Association, in a meeting, I should say, convened by the National Governors Association. And they talked about the importance of working together as one country to beat COVID. Addressing COVID and getting the pandemic under control is not a partisan issue. It's not an issue that's going to be solved by one party. It needs to be something that's done together with health experts and scientists, and certainly leaders from both parties. And as you also may know, today the president-elect and vice president-elect, later this afternoon, I should say, will host Speaker Pelosi and Leader Schumer for a meeting in Wilmington. Right. They'll discuss emergency aid that families desperately need, small businesses need, and state and local governments need at this critical point in time. Of course, the president-elect, and he also named several members of his team, about a little more than a dozen, including last week before we spoke, he of course had named his White House Chief of Staff, and this week, including some this morning, we've announced a number of diverse, qualified, and experienced individuals who will be filling important roles in the White House moving forward. And as we look ahead to next week and approach the Thanksgiving holiday, he's going to be focusing on continuing to address, be briefed on, speak out about the crises facing our country. We know this isn't a holiday season that most people would have envisioned.
Real quick, just back to the cabinet that Joe Biden is thinking of appointing. He was really, really coy yesterday in when someone asked him about who his Treasury Secretary will be, and he said he's going to announce that either before or after Thanksgiving. I would love it if Elizabeth Warren was tapped for that position. I want to know what you guys think about that.
And they will continue to do the work to ensure that during next year's holiday, we can celebrate with our loved ones. So with that, I will turn it over to Johannes.
Thanks, Jen. And thanks everyone for making the time to be here. As Jen mentioned, the GSA administrator has yet to ascertain the results of the election, despite an overwhelming consensus that Joe Biden is the winner of the election and therefore the president-elect. And as Jen also mentioned, we continue to move forward in the absence of an ascertainment decision. However, the non-ascertainment does place limits on the resources available to the transition and, most importantly, our access to federal agencies. This isn't a game who gets to talk to whom. Our inability to start our formal agency review process has the potential to have real impacts on families across the country. In fact, there's a growing chorus of national leaders who are calling upon GSA to move forward with the transition and sounding the alarm about the potentially harmful impact of further delays. Earlier this week, Dr. Fauci said that the lack of ascertainment would delay vaccine distribution. Leading medical groups, including the American Medical Association, the American Hospital Association, and the American Nurses Association, also wrote a letter urging the Trump administration to coordinate with the Biden transition on COVID-19 planning. Public health experts around the country echoed these sentiments and called for the GSA to stop delaying ascertainment and ensure a seamless transition as COVID-19 infection rates surge.
Transition to Gitmo. Nice.
Yesterday, numerous business leaders and groups released statements calling for the transition process to move forward, including the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, the Black Chamber of Commerce, the Business Roundtable, the National Association of Manufacturers, Small Business for America's Future, and other leading business leaders. And finally, as Jen mentioned, this week, the president-elect and the vice president-elect were briefed by former national security officials about the readiness of the diplomatic, defense, and intelligence agencies. As you know, they are still not able to receive the critically important classified briefings that should be available to them. And so the GSA administrator's inaction has the potential to have a real impact on families across the country. Now, even in the face of that, the transition team continues to do the work it is able to, including the continued rollout of senior White House officials. Last week, we announced during this briefing that the public jobs portal would be open on the website, and the personnel team is making strong progress in getting us ready to hit the ground on Inauguration Day with a diverse, talented team. So with that, I'd love to turn it over to Q&A.
Great, thank you both.
We'll go to Lisa for our first question. Lisa Desjardins.
Great, thank you guys for doing this.
Lisa Desjardins,
Appreciate
PBS
it.
NewsHour.
Hi guys, I've got a couple of questions. One, if generally you can talk about Vice President-elect Harris's role. She mentioned to reporters this week that she's had a very tight role, important role in the cabinet selections, and just anything more on that would be great. And then also on the COVID relief bill that I know President-elect Biden's talked a lot about, is he lobbying members of Congress directly, including today, Republicans and Democrats, to pass something now? Talk us about that, and would he be okay with something less than what Democrat leaders want because he needs something now?
I'll take the first question, and Jen, maybe you take the second one. The answer to the first question is easy in so much as Vice President-elect Harris has been an integral part of all personnel discussions that happened during the transition and will continue to play that role.
I will just add to your second
Okay.
question, Lisa. So as you know, President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Harris will be meeting with Speaker Pelosi and Leader Schumer later this afternoon. They are going to be working in lockstep, and they're in lockstep agreement that there needs to be emergency assistance and aid during the lame duck session to help families, to help small businesses. There's no more room for delay, and we need to move forward as quickly as possible. He, of course, is speaking with officials or elected officials from both sides of the aisle, and will continue to do that. But it's an important meeting this afternoon.
Yeah, so Phoenix, I really wasn't quite clear. I was following this whole Emily Murphy thing over the past couple days, just and I'm not following it, but just seeing tweets about her, and I wasn't quite sure what it was. But if she's denying to sign off on money, then
but he's been doing a range of calls. He has relationships, of course, that.
And I mean, it sounds like she's maybe she's tweeting out for help.
Later this afternoon, we're happy to share that.
Maybe that's a Kofefi tweet.
Great. We'll go to our next question from Eamon Jabbers.
Yeah, hey guys, thanks for doing this. Really appreciate the call. So earlier today, a group called Demand Progress put out a list of Democratic officials and veterans of previous administrations that it said were corporate Democrats and too close to oil and gas and other interests that they don't like. I'm wondering what effect that list, which includes people like Bruce Reed and Steve Ricchetti, is going to have on your decisions of how to staff up this White House. Are you going to take that into account in any way, or are you going to ignore it?
Well, Eamon, thanks for the question. And as you can see by the number of announcements that we've already made to date and the decisions that have been made by President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Harris, they're eager to get their team in place.
Just wasted off
and we've certainly seen this as they've had discussions and made decisions already, and you'll see this as more names come out in the weeks to come. That they
like maybe we can translate it.
And also the White House team and the teams that will fill these important roles to look like America, and that means there will be people from diverse backgrounds, diverse experiences, and a diversity of political views, including from all sides.
I can't
of the
translate that tweet.
Party. So we are certainly hearing from and listening to people and their thoughts and views, but he's made that commitment, and I would encourage people to wait until we've made even one announcement about a cabinet member, and certainly more than just a dozen White House names before they pass judgment. The last thing I would just say is that, President-elect Biden he campaigned as somebody who would be governing for all of the country. That means Democrats, that means independents, that means Republicans, that means people from all political ideologies. And his personnel decisions and his approach to how he's going to fill those seats and fill the important roles will be reflective of that. And that's the approach he'll continue to take.
And Jen, thanks for that. Just one quick follow-up, specifically on Wall Street. Does the president-elect see a Wall Street background as something that's helpful for potential White House staffers and cabinet officials, or does he see a Wall Street background as something that's not great to have on your resume?
Well, Eamon, I think as you know, and from having lived through the Obama-Biden, happily lived through the Obama-Biden administration myself, I think it's pretty safe to say that he's not a fan of Wall Street policies or an advocate for a lot of the policies that some people would be in favor of or be pushing for from that end. His record speaks for itself, and his advocacy and his words speak for themselves. And his team that he selects will be people who are implementing his policies, people who are implementing the Biden agenda. They're people who are committed to putting Americans back to work, to ensuring there's regulation where there needs to be, to ensuring that people have access to affordable health care. Those are the people who will be named to the cabinet and named to his team are there to implement his agenda. So I would certainly point people to words he said and his own background over the last several years.
Yeah, it's really hard for these guys to
Great. We'll take our next question
to answer any questions about the cabinet because they're still, trying to decide who's going to be in it. So it's like,
just wanted to ask if there has been
it's hard.
Any outreach to the transition team whatsoever from current Trump administration officials, and if so, what has their message been to the transition team?
Outreach?
And just the second
God, no.
question is President-elect Biden, he said
God, no, they'd
yesterday
be fired
that
like
he's not ruling out
ASAP.
legal action.
They
Can
reached
you
out.
just talk about at what point you will feel that all other options have been exhausted with respect to the GSA ascertainment, and when it might come to pass that you would consider legal action?
Well, I'll start, and Johannes may have some words of wisdom to add. So on your second question, the president-elect has made clear that, and we certainly share this, of course, given we all work for him, that our preference would be for the GSA administrator to sign the ascertainment, and we can all move forward. We can have access to intelligence briefings. We can have access to the information that's necessary to have our team working on vaccine distribution, have access to the current information they need. We can ensure that there wouldn't be a delay in Americans getting relief they need come January 20th. That's our preference. At the same time, I think there's a shared view that, or shared running out of patience happening. That's happening, as we can see, on Capitol Hill. That's happening with business leaders. That's happening with national security officials, because a smooth transition and a period of transition where the president-elect, the vice president-elect, national security officials and experts who are helping us get the pandemic under control have access to the information they need is essential for our democracy and for our country. So, I would say we've seen that escalate externally, and Johannes started off mentioning a couple of the business leaders and business groups. They want certainty in the economy. They know that if we have a delay in getting the information we need about vaccine distribution, that could delay that moving forward. The Biden administration is going to be responsible for the distribution of the majority of 300 million vaccines. If that is delayed, that could impact small businesses. That could impact the economy reopening. Everybody's looking for
and
certainty
look,
at this
that's
point.
that's a great point that she's making. And that's something I really haven't thought about, is that Joe Biden is going to be the one who's going to be distributing this. And the fact that, Donald Trump wants to talk about how he made the vaccines happen. He wants to take credit for it. He wants to, bring these people out, parade out these people in these task force briefings and talk about how they're going to take care of the distribution. A critical part of that is getting Joe Biden's team ready to work with those same people. So you can't have it, both ways and say that, you're the one who's responsible for this, and people should thank you for getting it and getting it out to people, when you're preventing President-elect Joe Biden from working to basically get the vaccine distributed. I mean, he's going to be the one who's going to be responsible for it. He's got to get ready to do that. You can't have it both ways, Don. And unfortunately, that's who Donald Trump is.
The last thing I'll just say is, no presidential transition would take options off the table. And we certainly aren't, but we would love it if this afternoon, or even during this call, during this briefing, if we learned that the GSA administrator signed the ascertainment and we could all move forward with continuing to prepare to govern.
Great, we'll take, oh, sorry, y'all.
The only thing I'd add there is we're consulting with a broad range of stakeholders outside of the government that have expertise in various lanes that'll be critical to governing. But at the end of the day, exactly as Jen said, there's no replacing the real-time information that can only come from the post-ascertainment environment that we should be in right now, in terms of regularized contact and regular contact with folks inside of the agencies who have information that would be vital to everything from our national security to, as Jen said, vaccine distribution.
Sorry, just to be clear, have you not had any outreach then from current Trump administration officials?
So just, Sabrina, it's a great question, and I know there's been some confusion about this. Our teams can't speak with or engage with current administration officials because the ascertainment has been delayed. And we would certainly love to have that engagement and love to be discussing with civil servants and people who have been experts on a range of issues, from foreign policy to health policy, preparations to take over January 20th. But our team has been very careful, of course, about following those rules and guidelines, and we'll have to abide by that until ascertainment happens.
Great. We'll take two more, and we'll move on to Arlette Syme.
Hi there. Yesterday, the president-elect talked a little bit about his cabinet selections, and I was wondering if you'd be able to provide kind of a target date for when you are planning to roll out that first cabinet nominee. And then also, I know you'll say that every cabinet position is important, but is there a certain priority that you guys have in mind for certain positions and getting those out first?
Sure. Well, Arlette, thank you for the question. So I've been doing this long enough to know not to get ahead of the president-elect. And certainly when he's ready to make his announcements about a cabinet, he'll do that. He indicated yesterday that that will be around Thanksgiving. That's aligned with the timing of the announcement of cabinet nominees back in 2008 when I was working on the Obama transition. And I expect you'll hear more from him on that soon. But since you gave us the opportunity, I just wanted to say one thing about the cabinet and the nominees. He is committed to selecting people, and as he indicated, has selected some people who are qualified, who are experienced, who are going to be prepared on day one to address the crises that our country is facing. And he will also put together a team that looks like America, that is diverse in terms of ideology and background as well. So that's how he's looking at putting together his team. And we certainly saw today that there were a number of Republicans who have indicated they'd be open to supporting nominees. That feels like a positive sign forward, because we know that the American people are not expecting obstruction. They're expecting members of both parties, Democrats and Republicans, to come together and help put qualified and experienced people in place to address the various crises that our country is facing. And I expect you'll know more soon. You'll know more in the coming weeks.
Great, thanks. And we'll take our last question from Sam Stein.
Hi, guys. Thanks for doing this. Much appreciated. This is a bit of a weird question, but obviously, as you're planning for the transition, this is happening during a spike in COVID. And there's articles about the difficulties in actually laying out the physical space of the White House and how to use it. I'm wondering if you can walk us through what type of decisions are being made, plans are being implemented to actually physically staff the premises of the White House come January 21st when you expect to be there.
So our top priority, as you saw in the campaign, and certainly as you've seen throughout the transition, is the following the science and abiding, keeping the safety of our team top of mind. And it's a dynamic situation with the pandemic, but I think we'll see the exact same adherence to and commitment to the science of keeping the team safe that you saw in the campaign, that you see during the transition. You'll see that as we enter into the White House physical space.
How does that manifest itself? Are we talking about fewer people actually working from the West Wing?
We don't have anything to share on that at this moment, but I think you can rest assured that we will follow the science and we'll put procedures in place to keep our team safe.
And as you can see, Sam, we are obviously not working in a transition office. Hence
I can see
children's art and such things. And Johannes obviously needs more pictures on this wall. But we also, President-elect and the Vice President-elect have conveyed to all of us that we should do our best to be model citizens as well, which means being safe. And I know this is just about this moment of time. Being safe, of course, wearing masks. Most of us are, of course, the vast majority are working remotely because, we want to be models for the country too.
Thanks, guys.
So
well, thank you,
a promised land just got here.
And
I almost want to just like spend the day reading it with you guys. I don't know how that'll go down. We have 111 people in here. Awesome, guys. Thank you guys for tuning in. If you're brand new to the channel, my name is Brendan Plank. I'm the creator of Reflect News here on YouTube. Progressive news source for informed citizenry, designed at keeping people informed. You can like the video if you haven't already. You can subscribe. You can follow me on Twitter if you'd like, at Brendan Plank. Let's see here. Just go to the YouTube homepage here. Oh boy, YouTube trending. You can follow me on Twitter at Brendan Plank. You can become a member to the channel. That link is down below for a couple bucks a month. I know it's really hard right now on people. So again, if you if that is something you can do, great. And then also, holidays are coming up, and I have some merchandise that I just put on Teespring, teespring.com/reflect-gear. I am going to put this on hold, I think. What I'd like to do is I'd like to just go grab the book down in the mailroom, and yeah, I'll be back, and then we'll read like the first chapter of Brock's book together. Let's see, I think I have like a be back screen or something. Let's see, what is this? Nope. Okay, so yeah, what I'll do is I'll come right back. All right. Now what I want to do is, sorry, I want to I'm gonna get the other microphone out. Oh, you guys can't hear me, can you? Kind of. Oh. So we got it here. Nice big book. It's going to take me a minute. I'm just going to set up a better microphone. Screw it. Fuck it, we'll do it live. All right, can you guys hear me okay? Does this thing sound okay? We're going to be reading for a little bit. There we go. That makes it easier. There we go. All right, we're gonna start soon, guys. Thank you for your patience here. That's a cool one. All right, just getting it ready. Giving you guys a little, just a chill little Please don't read, don't care. I'm just gonna read the first chapter, if that's what you're referring to. Uno chapter. There we go. Cool. Oh, okay. Yeah, yep. I just need to, I want to get Kayleigh McEnany's face off my. Okay. $50 likes. Wow, guys. Thank you for all the likes. That's awesome. You guys are great. Okay. Now I just need to do a little moving and shaking here. Boom. Sweet. All right. So hopefully the microphone sounds okay. Let's blow me up here a little bit. I should get on my reading robe. A Promised Land. Just came in. Can you see it? There we go. Next there. Boom. Okay. Well, hopefully my microphone sounds okay. A Promised Land, Barack Obama. To Michelle, my love and life's partner, and Malia and Sasha, whose dazzling light makes everything brighter. Oh, fly and never tire. Fly and never tire. Fly and never tire. There's a great camp meeting in the Promised Land. From an African American spiritual. Don't discount our powers. We have made a pass at the infinite. Robert Frost, Kitty Hawk. This is the preface. I began writing this book shortly after the end of my presidency, after Michelle and I had boarded Air Force One for the last time and traveled west for a long-deferred break. The mood on the plane was bittersweet. Both of us were drained, physically and emotionally, not only by the labors of the previous 8 years, but by the unexpected results of an election in which someone diametrically opposed to everything we stood for had been chosen as my successor. Still, having run our leg of the race to completion, we took satisfaction in knowing that we'd done our very best, and that however much I'd fallen short as president, whatever projects I'd hoped but failed to accomplish, the country was in better shape now than it had been when I'd started. For a month, Michelle and I slept late, ate leisurely dinners, went for long walks, swam in the ocean, took stock, replenished our friendship, rediscovered our love, and planned for a less eventful but hopefully no less satisfying second act. And by the time I was ready to get back to work and sat down with a pen and yellow pad, I still like writing things out in longhand, finding that a computer gives even my roughest drafts too smooth a gloss and lends half-baked thoughts the mask of tidiness. I had a clear outline of the book in my head. First and foremost, I hoped to give an honest rendering of my time in office, not just a historical record of key events that happened on my watch and important figures with whom I'd interacted, but also an account of some of the political, economic, and cultural cross-currents that helped determine the challenges my administration faced and the choices my team and I made in response. Where possible, I wanted to offer readers a sense of what it's like to be the President of the United States. I wanted to pull the curtain back a bit and remind people that, for all its power and pomp, the presidency is still just a job, and our federal government is a human enterprise like any other. And the men and women who work in the White House experience the same daily mix of satisfaction, disappointment, office friction, screw-ups, and small triumphs as the rest of their fellow citizens. Finally, I wanted to tell a more personal story that might inspire young people considering a life of public service. How my career in politics really started with a search for a place to fit in, a way to explain the different strands of my mixed-up heritage, and how it was only by hitching my wagon to something larger than myself that I was ultimately able to locate a community and purpose for my life. I figured I could do all that in maybe 500 pages. I expected to be done in a year. It's fair to say that the writing process didn't go exactly as I'd planned. Despite my best intentions, the book kept growing in length and scope. The reason why I eventually decided to break it into 2 volumes, I'm painfully aware that a more gifted writer could have found a way to tell the same story with greater brevity. After all, my home office in the White House sat right next to the Lincoln bedroom, where a signed copy of the 272-word Gettysburg Address rests beneath a glass case. But each time that I sat down to write, whether it was to describe the early phases of my campaign or my administration's handling of the financial crisis or negotiations with Russians on nuclear arms control, or the forces that led to the Arab Spring, I found my mind resisting a simple, linear narrative. Often, I felt obliged to provide context for the decisions I and others had made, and I didn't want to relegate the background to footnotes or endnotes. I hate footnotes and endnotes. I discovered that I couldn't always explain my motivations just by referencing reams of economic data or recalling an exhaustive Oval Office briefing, for they'd been shaped by a conversation I'd had with a stranger on the campaign trail, a visit to the military hospital, or a childhood lesson I'd received years earlier from my mother. Repeatedly, my memories would toss up seemingly incidental details, trying to find a discreet location to grab an evening smoke, my staff and I having a laugh while playing cards aboard Air Force One, that captured, in a way, the public record never could. My lived experience during the 8 years I spent in the White House. Beyond the struggle to put words on a page, what I didn't fully anticipate was the way events would unfold during the 3.5 years after that last flight on Air Force One. As I sit here, the country remains in the grips of a global pandemic and the accompanying economic crisis, with more than 178,000 Americans dead, businesses shuttered, and millions of people out of work. Across the nation, people from all walks of life have poured into the streets to protest the deaths of unarmed black men and women at the hands of the police. Perhaps most troubling of all, our democracy seems to be teetering on the brink of crisis. A crisis rooted in a fundamental contest between 2 opposing visions of what America is and what it should be. A crisis that has left the body politic divided, angry, and mistrustful, and has allowed for an ongoing breach of institutional norms, procedural safeguards, and the adherence to basic facts that both Republicans and Democrats once took for granted. This contest is not new, of course. In many ways, it has defined the American experience. It's embedded in founding documents that could simultaneously proclaim all men equal and yet count a slave as 3/5 of a man. It finds expression in our earliest court opinions, as when the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court bluntly explains to Native Americans that their tribe's rights to convey property aren't enforceable, since the court of the conqueror has no capacity to recognize the just claims of the conquered. It's a contest that's been fought on the fields of Gettysburg and Appomattox, but also in the halls of Congress, on a bridge in Selma, across the vineyards of California, and down the streets of New York. A contest fought by soldiers, but more often by union organizers, suffragists, Pullman porters, student leaders, waves of immigrants, and LGBTQ activists, armed with nothing more than picket signs, pamphlets, or a pair of marching shoes. At the heart of this long-running battle is a simple question. Do we care to match the reality of America to its ideals? If so, do we really believe that our notions of self-government and individual freedom, equality of opportunity, and equality before the law apply to everybody? Or are we instead committed in practice, if not in statute, to reserving those things for a privileged few? I recognize that there are those who believe that it's time to discard that myth, that an examination of America's past and an even cursory glance at today's headlines show that this nation's ideals have always been secondary to conquest and subjugation, a racial caste system, and rapacious capitalism, and that to pretend otherwise is to be complicit in a game that was rigged from the start. And I confess that there have been times during the course of writing this book, as I've reflected on my presidency and all that's happened since, when I've had to ask myself whether I was too tempered in speaking the truth as I saw it, too cautious in either word or deed, convinced as I was that by appealing to what Lincoln called the better angels of our nature, I stood a greater chance of leading us in the direction of the America we've been promised. I don't know. What I can say for certain is that I'm not ready to abandon the possibility of America, not just for the sake of future generations of Americans, but for all humankind. For I'm convinced that the pandemic we're currently living through is both a manifestation of and a mere interruption in the relentless march toward an interconnected world, one in which peoples and cultures can't help but collide. In that world of global supply chains, instantaneous capital transfers, social media, transnational terrorist networks, climate change, mass migration, and ever-increasing complexity, we will learn to live together, cooperate with one another, and recognize the dignity of others, or we will perish. And so the world watches America, the only great power in history made up of people from every corner of the planet, comprising every race and faith and cultural practice, to see if our experiment in democracy can work. To see if we can do what no other nation has ever done. To see if we can actually live up to the meaning of our creed. The jury's still out. By the time this first volume is published, a U.S. election will have taken place. And while I believe the stakes could not be higher, I also know that no single election will settle the matter. If I remain hopeful, it's because I've learned to place my faith in my fellow citizens, especially those of the next generation, whose conviction in the equal worth of all people seems to come as second nature, and who insist on making real those principles that their parents and teachers told them were true, but perhaps never fully believed themselves. More than anyone, this book is for the young people. An invitation to once again remake the world and to bring about, through hard work, determination, and a big dose of imagination, an America that finally aligns with all that is best in us. Part 1. The bet. How are we doing? How are we doing in the comments, guys? Oh, Tomas, man. Thank you, Thomas. Appreciate it, man. Much love, much love. How are we doing, guys? Does the mic sound okay? Are we all hanging in there? The reading is okay? Okay, great, Jesse. Awesome. Great. Hey, Face Woman. Good to see you back. Okay, Chapter 1. Let's get into it. Of all the rooms and halls and landmarks that make up the White House and its grounds, it was the West Colonnade that I loved the best. For 8 years, that walkway would frame my day, a minute-long open-air commute from home to office and back again. It was where each morning I felt the first slap of winter wind or pulse of summer heat. The place where I'd gather my thoughts, ticking through the meetings that lay ahead, preparing arguments for skeptical members of Congress or anxious constituents, girding myself for this decision or that slow-rolling crisis. In the earliest days of the White House, the executive offices and the First Family's residence fit under one roof, and the West Colonnade was little more than a path to the horse stables. But when Teddy Roosevelt came into office, he determined that a single building couldn't accommodate a modern staff, 6 boisterous children, and his sanity. He ordered construction of what would become the West Wing and Oval Office. And over decades and successive presidencies, the colonnade's current configuration emerged. A bracket to the Rose Garden north and west. The thick wall on the north side, mute and unadorned save for high half-moon windows, the stately white columns on the west side, like an honor guard, assuring safe passage. As a general rule, I'm a slow walker, a Hawaiian walk, Michelle likes to say, sometimes with a hint of impatience. I walk differently, though on the colonnade, conscious of the history that had been made there and those who had preceded me. My stride got longer, my steps a bit brisker, my footfall on stone echoed by the Secret Service detail trailing me a few yards back. When I reached the ramp at the end of the colonnade, a legacy of FDR and his wheelchair, I pictured him smiling, chin out, cigarette holder clenched tight in his teeth as he strains to roll up the incline. I'd wave at the uniformed guard just inside the glass pane door. Sometimes the guard would be holding back a surprised flock of visitors. If I had time, I would shake their hands and ask where they were from. Usually, though, I just turned left, following the outer wall of the cabinet room and slipping into the side door by the Oval Office, where I greeted my personal staff, grabbed my schedule and a cup of hot tea, and started the business of the day. Several times a week, I would step out onto the colonnade to find the groundskeepers. I'm colonnade, back and forth. Apologize, guys. Several times a week, I would step out onto the colonnade to find the groundskeepers, all employees of the National Park Service, working in the Rose Garden. They were older men, mostly dressed in green khaki uniforms, sometimes matched with a floppy hat to block the sun, or a bulky coat against the cold. If I wasn't running late, I might stop to compliment them on the fresh plantings, or ask about the damage done by the previous night's storm. And they'd explain their work with quiet pride. They were men of few words. Even with one another, they made their points with a gesture or a nod, each of them focused on his individual task, but all of them moving with synchronized grace. One of the oldest was Ed Thomas, a tall, wiry black man with sunken cheeks who had worked at the White House for 40 years. The first time I met him, he reached into his back pocket for a cloth to wipe off the dirt before shaking my hand. His hand, thick with veins and knots like the roots of a tree, engulfed mine. I asked how much longer he intended to stay at the White House before taking his retirement. "I don't know, Mr. President," he said. "I like to work, getting a little hard on the joints, but I reckon I might stay as long as you're here. Make sure the garden looks good." Oh, how good that garden looked. The shady magnolias rising high at each corner, the hedges thick and rich green, the crabapple trees pruned just so, and the flowers, cultivated in greenhouses a few miles away, providing a constant explosion of color, reds and yellows and pinks and purples. In spring, the tulips massed in bunches, their heads tilted toward the sun. In summer, lavender heliotrope and geraniums and lilies. In fall, chrysanthemums and daisies and wildflowers. And always a few roses, red mostly, but sometimes yellow or white, each one flush in its bloom. Barack Obama, man. Yeah, I'm not a good writer. Stuff's poetry, man. Each time I walked down the colonnade or looked out the window of the Oval Office, I saw the handiwork of the men and women who worked outside. They reminded me of the small, They reminded me of the small Norman Rockwell painting I kept on the wall, next to the portrait of George Washington and above the bust of Dr. King. 5 tiny figures of varying skin tones, working men in dungarees, hoisted up by ropes into a crisp blue sky to polish the lamp of Lady Liberty. The men in the painting, the groundskeepers in the garden, they were guardians, I thought. The quiet priests of a good and solemn order. And I would tell myself that I needed to work as hard and take as much care in my job as they did in theirs. With time, my walks down the colonnade would accumulate with memories. There were the big public events, of course, announcements made before a phalanx of cameras, press conferences with foreign leaders. But there were also the moments few others saw. Malia and Sasha racing each other to greet me on a surprise afternoon visit, or our dogs, Bo and Sunny, bounding through the snow, their paws sinking so deep that their chins were bearded white. Tossing footballs on a bright fall day, or comforting an aide after a personal hardship. Such images would often flash through my mind, interrupting whatever calculations were occupying me. They reminded me of time passing, sometimes filling me with longing, a desire to turn back the clock and begin again. This wasn't possible on my morning walk, for time's arrow moved only forward then. The day's work beckoned. I needed to focus on only the things to come. The night was different. On the evening walk back to the residence, my briefcase stuffed with papers, I would try to slow myself down, sometimes even stop. I'd breathe air laced with the scent of soil and grass and pollen, and listen to the wind or the patter of rain. I sometimes stared at the light against the columns and the regal mass of the White House, its flag aloft on the roof, lit bright, or I'd look toward the Washington Monument, piercing the black sky in the distance, occasionally catching sight of the moon and stars above it, or the twinkling of a passing jet. In moments like these, I would wonder at the strange path and at the idea that had brought me to this place. I don't come from a political family. My maternal grandparents were Midwesterners from mostly Scots-Irish stock. They would have been considered liberal, especially by the standards of the Depression-era Kansas towns they were born in, and they were diligent about keeping up with the news. It's part of being a well-informed citizen, my grandmother, whom we called a toot, short for tutu, or grandma in Hawaiian. That's also what I called my mom's mother, my maternal grandmother. Tutu and Papa. It's part of being a well-informed citizen, my grandmother, who we called Toot, would tell me, peering over the top of her morning Honolulu advertiser. But she and my grandfather had no firm ideological or partisan leanings to speak of, beyond what they considered to be common sense. They thought about work. My grandmother was vice president of escrow at one of the local banks, my grandfather a life insurance salesman and paying the bills, and the small diversions that life had to offer. And anyway, they lived in Oahu, where nothing seemed that urgent. After years spent in places as disparate as Oklahoma, Texas, and Washington State, they'd finally moved to Hawaii in 1960, a year after its statehood was established. A big ocean now separated them from riots and protests and other such things. The only political conversation I can recall my grandparents having while I was growing up had to do with a beachside bar. Honolulu's mayor had torn down Gramps' favorite watering hole in order to renovate the beachfront at the far end of Waikiki. Gramps never forgave him for it. My mother, Ann Durham, was different, full of strong opinions. My grandparents' only child. She rebelled against convention in high school, reading beatnik poets and French existentialists, joyriding with a friend to San Francisco for days without telling anyone. As a kid, I'd hear from her about civil rights marches and why the Vietnam War was a misguided disaster, about the women's movement, yes on equal pay, not as keen on not shaving her legs, and the war on poverty. When we moved to Indonesia to live with my stepfather, she made sure to explain the sins of government corruption. It's just stealing, Barry, even if everyone appeared to be doing it. Later, during the summer, I turned 12 when we went on a month-long family vacation traveling across the United States. She insisted we watch the Watergate hearings every night, providing her own running commentary. What do you expect from a McCarthyite? She would say. She didn't just focus on headlines either. Once, when she discovered I had been part of a group that was teasing a kid at school, she sat me down in front of her, lips pursed with disappointment. "You know, Barry," she said. That's the nickname she and my grandparents used for me when I was growing up, often shortened to Bear, pronounced Bear. "There are people in this world who think only about themselves. They don't care what happens to other people so long as they get what they want. They put other people down to make themselves feel important. Then there are people who do the opposite, who are able to imagine how others must feel and make sure that they don't do things that hurt people. So," she said, looking me squarely in the eye, "which kind of person do you want to be?" I felt lousy, as she intended it to. Her question stayed with me for a long time. For my mother, the world was full of opportunities for moral instruction, but I never knew her to get involved in a political campaign. Like my grandparents, she was suspicious of platforms, doctrines, absolutes, preferring to express her values on a smaller canvas. The world is complicated, Bear. That's why it's interesting. Dismayed by the war in Southeast Asia, she'd end up spending most of her life there, absorbing the language and culture, setting up micro-lending programs for people in poverty long before microcredit became trendy in international development. Appalled by racism, she would marry outside her race, not once but twice, and go on to lavish what seemed like an inexhaustible love on her 2 brown children. Incensed by societal constraints put upon women, she'd divorce both men when they proved overbearing or disappointing, carving out a career of her own choosing, raising her kids according to her own standards of decency, and pretty much doing whatever she damn well pleased. In my mother's world, the personal really was political, although she wouldn't have had much use for the slogan. None of this is to say that she lacked ambition for her son, despite the financial strain she and my grandparents would send me to Punahou, Hawaii's top prep school. The thought of me not going to college was never entertained, but no one in my family would have ever suggested I might hold public office someday. If you'd asked my mother, she might have imagined that I'd end up heading a philanthropic institution like the Ford Foundation. My grandparents would have loved to see me become a judge or a great courtroom lawyer like Perry Mason. "Might as well put that smart mouth of his to use," Gramps would say. Since I don't know my father, he didn't have much input. I vaguely understood that he had worked for the Kenyan government for a time, and when I was 10, he traveled from Kenya to stay with us for a month in Honolulu. That was the first and last I saw of him. After that, I heard from him only through the occasional letter written on the thin blue airmail paper that was pre-printed to fold and address without an envelope. Quote, "Your mother tells me you think you may want to study architecture," one letter might read. "I think this is a very practical profession and one that can be practiced anywhere in the world." It was not much to go on. As for the world beyond my family, well, they would see for most of my teenage years was not a budding leader, but rather a lackadaisical student, a passionate basketball player of limited talent, and an incessant, dedicated partier. No student government for me, no Eagle Scouts or interning at the local congressman's office. Through high school, my friends and I didn't discuss much beyond sports, girls, music, and plans for getting loaded. 3 of these guys, Bobby Titcomb, Greg Orm, and Mike Ramos, remain some of my closest friends. To this day, we can laugh for hours over stories of our misspent youth. In later years, they would throw themselves into my campaigns with a loyalty for which I will always be grateful, becoming as skilled at defending my record as anyone on MSNBC. But there were also times during my presidency, after they had watched me speak to a big crowd, say, or receive a series of crisp salutes from young Marines during a base tour, when their faces would betray a certain bafflement, as if they were trying to reconcile the graying man in a suit and tie with the ill-defined man-child they'd once known. That guy? They must have said to themselves, how the hell did that happen? And if my friends had ever asked me directly, I'm not sure I'd have a good answer. I do know that sometime in high school, I started asking questions about my father's absence and my mother's choices, about how it was I'd come to live in a place where few people looked like me. A lot of the questions centered on race. Why did blacks play professional basketball but not coach it? What did that girl from school mean when she said she didn't think of me as black? Why were all the black men in action movies switchblade-wielding lunatics? Why were all the black men in action movies switchblade-yielding lunatics, except for maybe that one decent black guy, the sidekick, of course, who always seemed to end up getting killed? But I wasn't concerned only with race. It was class as well. Growing up in Indonesia, I'd seen the yawning chasm between the lives of wealthy elites and impoverished masses. I had a nascent awareness of the tribal tensions in my father's country, the hatred that could exist between those who on the surface might look the same. I bore daily witness to the seemingly cramped lives of my grandparents, the disappointments they filled with TV and liquor and sometimes a new appliance or car. I noticed that my mother paid for intellectual freedom with chronic financial struggles and occasional personal chaos, and I became attuned to the not-so-subtle hierarchies among my prep school classmates, mostly having to do with how much money their parents had. And then there was the unsettling fact that, despite whatever my mom might claim, the bullies, cheats, and the self-promoters seemed to be doing quite well, while those she considered good and decent people seemed to get screwed an awful lot. All of this pulled me in different directions. It was as if, because of the very strangeness of my heritage and the worlds I straddled, I was from everywhere and nowhere at once. A combination of ill-fitting parts like a platypus or some imaginary beast confined to a fragile habitat, unsure of where I belonged. And I sensed, without fully understanding why or how, that unless I could stitch my life together and situate myself along some firm axis, I might end up in some basic way living my life alone. I didn't talk to anyone about this, certainly not my friends or family. I didn't want to hurt their feelings or stand out more than I already did, but I did find refuge in books. The reading habit was my mother's doing, instilled early in my childhood. Her go-to move anytime I complained of boredom, or when she couldn't afford to send me to the international school in Indonesia, or when I had to accompany her to the office because she didn't have a babysitter. "Go read a book," she would say, "then come back and tell me something you learned." There were a few years when I lived with my grandparents in Hawaii while my mother continued her work in Indonesia and raised my younger sister Maya. Without my mother around to nag me, I didn't learn as much, as my grades readily attested. Then, around 10th grade, that changed. I still remember going with my grandparents to a rummage sale at the Central Union Church across the street from our apartment and finding myself in front of a bin of old hardcover books. For some reason I started pulling out titles that appealed to me or sounded vaguely familiar. Books by Ralph Ellison and Langston Hughes, Robert Penn Warren, or Dostoevsky, D.H. Lawrence, and Ralph Waldo Emerson. Gramps, who was eyeing a set of used golf clubs, gave me a confused look when I walked up with my box of books. "Planning to open a library?" My grandmother shushed him, finding my sudden interest in literature admirable. Ever practical, she did suggest I might want to focus on my class assignments before digging into Crime and Punishment. I ended up reading all those books, sometimes late, after I got home from basketball practice and a six-pack with my friends. Sometimes after body surfing on a Saturday afternoon, sitting alone in Gramps' rickety old Ford Granada with a towel around my waist to avoid getting the upholstery wet. When I finished the first set of books, I went to the other rummage sales, looking for more. Much of what I read I only dimly understood. I took to circling unfamiliar words to look up in the dictionary, although I was less scrupulous about decoding pronunciations. Deep into my 20s, I would know the meaning of words I couldn't pronounce. There was also no system to this, no rhyme or pattern. I was like a young tinkerer in my parents' garage, gathering up old cathode ray tubes and bolts and loose wires. Not sure what I'd do with any of it, but convinced it would prove handy once I figured out the nature of my calling. My interest in books probably explains why I not only survived high school, but arrived at Occidental College in 1979 with a thin but passable knowledge of political issues and a series of half-baked opinions that I'd toss out during late-night bull sessions in the dorm. So, okay. Awesome. Okay. Moving on. Hopefully you guys are doing okay. Looking back, it's embarrassing to recognize the degree to which my intellectual curiosity, those first 2 years of college, paralleled the interests of various women I was attempting to get to know. Marx and Marcuse, so I had something to say to the long-legged socialists who lived in my dorm. Fannin and Gwendolyn Brooks for the smooth-skinned sociology major who never gave me a second look. Foucault and Wolff for the ethereal bisexual who wore mostly black. As a strategy for picking up girls, my pseudo-intellectualism proved mostly worthless. I found myself in a series of affectionate but chaste friendships. Still, these halting efforts served a purpose. Something approaching a worldview took shape in my mind. I was helped along by a handful of professors who tolerated my iffy study habits and my youthful pretensions. I was helped even more by a handful of mostly older students, black kids from the inner city, white kids who had scratched their way into college from small towns, first-generation Latino kids, international students from Pakistan or India or countries in Africa that teetered on the edge of chaos. They knew what mattered to them. When they spoke in class, their views were rooted in actual communities, actual struggles. Here's what these budget cuts mean in my neighborhood. Let me tell you about my school before you complain about affirmative action. The First Amendment is great, but why does the US government say nothing about the political prisoners in my country? The 2 years I spent at Occidental represented the start of my political awakening. But that didn't mean I believed in politics. With few exceptions, everything I observed about politicians seemed dubious. The blow-dried hair, the wolfish grins, the bromides and self-peddling on TV, while behind closed doors they curried the favor of corporations and other moneyed interests. They were actors in a rigged game, I decided, and I wanted no part of that. What did capture my attention was something broader and less conventional. Not political campaigns, but social movements, where ordinary people joined together to make change. I became a student of the suffragists and early labor organizers of Gandhi and Lech Walesa and the African National Congress. Most of all, I was inspired by the young leaders of the civil rights movement, not just Dr. King, but John Lewis and Bob Moses, Fannie Lou Hamer, and Diane Nash, in their heroic efforts going door to register voters, sitting down at lunch counters and marching to freedom songs. I saw the possibility of practicing the values my mother had taught me, how you could build power not by putting others down, but by lifting them up. This was true democracy at work. Democracy not as a gift from on high or a division of spoils between interest groups, but rather democracy that was earned, the work of everybody. The result was not just a change in material conditions, but a sense of dignity for people and communities, a bond between those who had once seemed far apart. This, I decided, was an ideal worth pursuing. I just needed focus. After my sophomore year, I transferred to Columbia University, figuring it would be a new start. For 3 years in New York, holed up in a series of dilapidated apartments, largely shorn of old friends and bad habits, I lived like a monk, reading, writing, filling up journals, rarely bothering with college parties or even eating hot meals. I got lost in my head, preoccupied with questions that seemed to layer themselves one over the next. What made some movements succeed where others failed? Was it a sign of success when portions of a cause were absorbed by conventional politics, or was it a sign that the cause had been hijacked? When was compromise acceptable, and when was it selling out? And how did one know the difference? Oh, how earnest I was then. How fierce and humorless. When I look back on my journal entries from this time, I feel a great affection for the young man that I was, aching to make a mark on the world, wanting to be part of something grand and idealistic, which evidence seemed to indicate did not exist. This was America in the early 1980s, after all. The social movements of the previous decade had lost their vibrancy. A new conservatism was taking hold. Ronald Reagan was president. The economy was in recession. The Cold War was in full swing. If I were to travel back in time, I might urge the young man I was to set the books aside for a moment, open the windows and let in some fresh air. My smoking habit was then in full bloom. I'd tell him to relax, go meet some people, and enjoy the pleasures that life reserves for those in their 20s. The few friends I had in New York tried to offer similar advice. You need to lighten up, Rock. You need to get laid. You're so idealistic. It's great, but I don't know if what you're saying is really possible. I resisted these voices. I resisted precisely because I feared they were right. Whatever I was incubating during those hours spent alone, whatever vision for a better world I'd let flourish in the hothouse of my youthful mind, it could hardly withstand even a simple conversational road test. In the gray light of Manhattan winter and against the overarching cynicism of the times, my ideas, spoken aloud in class or over coffee with friends, came off as fanciful and far-fetched. And I knew it. In fact, it's one of the things that may have saved me from becoming a full-blown crank before I reached the age of 22. At some basic level, I understood the absurdity of my vision, how wide the gap between my grand ambitions and anything I was actually doing in my life. I was like a young Walter Mitty, a Don Quixote with no Sancho Panza. This too can be found in my journal entries from that time, a pretty accurate chronicle of all my shortcomings. My preference for navel-gazing over action, a certain reserve, even shyness, traceable perhaps to my Hawaiian and Indonesian upbringing, but also the result of a deep self-consciousness, a sensitivity to rejection or looking stupid, maybe even a fundamental laziness. I took it upon myself to purge such softness with a regimen of self-improvement that I never entirely shed. Michelle and the girls point out to this day that I can't get into the pool or the ocean without feeling compelled to swim laps. Why don't you just wade? They'll say with a snicker. It's fun. Here, we'll show you how. I made lists. I started working out, going for runs around the Central Park Reservoir or along the East River and eating cans of tuna fish and hard-boiled eggs for fuel. I stripped myself of excess belongings. Who needs more than 5 shirts? What great contest was I preparing for? Whatever it was, I knew I wasn't ready. That uncertainty, that self-doubt, kept me from settling too quickly on easy answers. I got into the habit of questioning my own assumptions, and this, I think, ultimately came in handy, not only because it prevented me from becoming insufferable, but because it inoculated me against the revolutionary formulas embraced by a lot of people on the left at the dawn of the Reagan era. Certainly that was true when it came to questions of race. I experienced my fair share of racial slights and could see all too well the enduring legacy of slavery and Jim Crow anytime I walked through Harlem or parts of the Bronx. But by dint of biography, I learned not to claim my own victimhood too readily and resisted the notion held by some of the black folks I knew that white people were irredeemably racist. The conviction of racism wasn't inevitable may also explain my willingness to defend the American idea, what the country was, and what it could be. My mother and grandparents had never been noisy in their patriotism, reciting the Pledge of Allegiance in class, waving small flags on the 4th of July. These were treated as pleasant rituals, not sacred duties. Their attitudes towards Easter and Christmas were pretty much the same. Even Gramps' service in World War II was downplayed. He told me more about eating K-rations, terrible, than he ever told me about the glory of marching in Patton's army. And yet the pride in being American, the notion that America was the greatest country on earth, that was always a given. As a young man, I chafed against books that dismissed the notion of American exceptionalism, got into long, drawn-out arguments with friends who insisted the American hegemon was the root of oppression worldwide. I had lived overseas. I knew too much. That America fell perpetually short of its ideals. That America fell perpetually short of its ideals, I readily conceded. The version of American history taught in schools with slavery glossed over and the slaughter of Native Americans all but omitted, that I did not defend. The blundering exercises of military power, the rapaciousness of multinationals. Yeah, I got all that. But the idea of America, the promise of America, this I clung to, with stubbornness that surprised even me. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. That was my America. The America Tocqueville wrote about, the countryside of Whitman and Thoreau, with no person my inferior or my better. The America of pioneers heading west in search of a better life, or immigrants landing on Ellis Island propelled by a yearning for freedom. It was the America of Thomas Edison and the Wright brothers making dreams take flight and Jackie Robinson stealing home. It was Chuck Berry and Bob Dylan, Billie Holiday, and the Village Vanguard and Johnny Cash at Folsom State Prison. All those misfits who took the scraps that others overlooked or discarded and made beauty that no one had seen before. It was the America of Lincoln at Gettysburg, and Jane Addams toiling in a Chicago settlement home, and wary GIs at Normandy, and Dr. King on the National Mall, summoning courage in others and in himself. It was the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, crafted by flawed but brilliant thinkers who reasoned their way to a system at once sturdy and capable of change. An America that could explain me. Dream on, Barack, is how those arguments with my college friends would usually end, as some smug bastard dropped a newspaper in front of me, its headlines trumpeting the U.S. invasion of Grenada, or cuts the school lunch program, or some other disheartening news. Sorry, but that's your America. Such was my state when I graduated in 1983. Big ideas and nowhere to go. There were no movements to join, no selfless leaders to follow. The closest I could find to what I had in mind was something called community organizing. Grassroots work that brought ordinary people together around issues of local concern. After bouncing around in a couple of ill-fitting jobs in New York, I heard about a position in Chicago, working with a group of churches that were trying to stabilize communities racked by steel plant closures. Nothing grand, but a place to start. I've recorded elsewhere my organizing years in Chicago. Victories were small and transitory in the mostly black working class neighborhoods where I spent my time. My organization was a bit player in its attempts to address the changes that were sweeping not just Chicago, but cities across the country. The decline of manufacturing, white flight, the rise of a discrete and disconnected underclass, even as a new knowledge class began to fuel gentrification in the urban core. But if my own impact on Chicago was small, the city changed the arc of my life. Chicago's, you guys, if you guys haven't been to Chicago, Chicago is that city is amazing. That's not in the book. That's my own personal opinion. For starters, it got me out of my own head. I had to listen to and not just theorize about what mattered to people. I had to ask strangers to join me and one another on real-life projects, fixing up a park, or removing asbestos from a housing project, or starting an after-school program. I experienced failure and learned to buck up so I could rally those who'd put their trust in me. I suffered rejections and insults often enough to stop fearing them. In other words, I grew up and got my sense of humor back. I came to love the men and women I worked with, the single mom living in a ravaged block who somehow got all 4 children through college, the Irish priest who threw open the church doors every evening so that kids had an option other than gangs, the laid-off steel worker who went back to school to become a social worker. Their stories of hardship and their modest victories confirmed for me again and again the basic decency of people. Through them, I saw the transformation that took place when citizens held their leaders and institutions to account. Even on something as small as putting in a stop sign on a busy corner or getting more police patrols. I noticed how people stood up a little straighter, saw themselves differently when they learned that their voices mattered. Through them, I resolved the lingering questions of my racial identity. for it turned out there was no single way to be black. Just trying to be a good man was enough. Through them, I discovered a community of faith, that it was okay to doubt, to question, and still reach for something beyond the here and now. And because I heard in church basements, and on bungalow porches the very same values, honesty and hard work and empathy, that had been drilled into me by my mother and grandparents, I came to trust the common thread that existed between people. I can't help but wonder sometimes what would have happened if I had stayed with organizing, or at least some version of it. Like many local heroes I've met over the years, I might have managed to build up in an institution that could reshape a neighborhood or a portion of the city. Anchored deep in a community, I might have steered money and imagination to change not the world, but just the one place, or that one set of kids. Doing work that touched the lives of neighbors and friends in some measurable and useful way. But I didn't stay. I left for Harvard Law School, and here's where the story gets murkier in my mind, with my motives open to interpretation. I told myself then, and like to tell myself still, that I left organizing because I saw work I was doing as too slow, too limited, not able to match the needs of the people I hoped to serve. A local job training center couldn't make up for the thousands of steel jobs lost by a plant closing. An after-school program couldn't compensate for chronically underfunded schools, or kids raised by their grandparents because both parents were doing time. On every issue, it seemed, we kept bumping up against somebody, a politician, a bureaucrat, some distant CEO, who had the power to make things better, but didn't. And when we get concessions from them, it was most often too little too late. The power to shape budgets and guide policy was what we needed, and that power lay elsewhere. Moreover, I came to realize that just 2 years before I arrived, there had been a movement for change in Chicago, one that was both social and political, a deep, swift current that I had failed to fully appreciate because it hadn't conformed to my theories. It was the movement to elect Harold Washington as the city's first black mayor. It seemed like it sprang out of nowhere, as grassroots a political campaign as anything modern politics had ever seen. A small band of black activists and business leaders, tired of the chronic bias and inequities of America's most segregated big city, decided to register a record number of voters and then drafted a rotund congressman of prodigious talent but limited ambition to run for an office that appeared well out of reach. Nobody thought it had a chance. Even Harold was skeptical. The campaign operated hand to mouth, staffed largely by inexperienced volunteers. But then it happened. Some form of spontaneous combustion. People who had never thought about politics, people who had never even voted, got swept up in the cause. Seniors and school children started sporting the campaign's blue buttons. A collective unwillingness to keep putting up with the steady accumulation of unfairness and slights. All the bogus traffic stops and secondhand textbooks, all the times black folks walked past a Park District field house on the north side and noticed how much nicer it was than the one in their neighborhood. All the times they'd been passed over for promotions or denied bank loans, gathered like a cyclone and toppled the city hall. By the time I arrived in Chicago, Harold was halfway through his first term. The city council, once a rubber stamp for Old Man Daley, had divided into racial camps. A controlling majority of white aldermen blocking interracial a controlling majority of white aldermen blocking every reform that Harold proposed. He tried to wheedle and cut deals, but they wouldn't budge. It was riveting television, tribal and raw, but it limited what Harold could deliver for those who'd elected him. It took a federal court redrawing a racially gerrymandered aldermanic map for Harold to finally get the majority and break the deadlock. And before he could realize many of the changes he'd promised, he was dead of a heart attack. A scion of the old order, Rich Daley ultimately regained his father's throne. Far from the center of the action, I watched this drama unfold and tried to absorb its lessons. I saw how the tremendous energy of the movement couldn't be sustained without structure, organization, and skills in governance. I saw how a political campaign based on racial Racial redress, no matter how reasonable, generated fear and backlash and ultimately placed limits on progress. And in the end, and in the rapid collapse of Harold's coalition after his death, I saw the danger of relying on a single charismatic leader to bring about change. And what a force he was for those 5 years. Despite the roadblocks, Chicago changed on his watch. City services, from tree trimming to snow removal to road repair, came to be spread more evenly across wards. New schools were built in poor neighborhoods, city jobs were no longer subject solely to patronage, and the business community, at long last, started paying attention to the lack of diversity in their ranks. Above all, Harold gave people hope. The way Black Chicagoans talked about him in those years was reminiscent of how a certain generation of white progressives talked about Bobby Kennedy. It wasn't so much what he did as how he made you feel, like anything was possible, like the world was yours to remake. For me, this planted a seed. It made me think for the first time that I wanted to someday run for public office. I wasn't the only one thus inspired. It was shortly after Harold's election that Jesse Jackson would announce he was running for president. Wasn't this where the energy of the civil rights movement had migrated? Into electoral politics? John Lewis, Andrew Young, Julian Bond, hadn't they run for office deciding this was the arena where they could make the most difference? I knew there were pitfalls. The compromises, the constant money chase, the losing track of ideals, and the relentless pursuit of winning. But maybe there was another way. Maybe you could generate the same energy, the same sense of purpose, not just within the Black community, but across racial lines. Maybe with enough preparation, policy know-how, and management skills, you could avoid some of Harold's mistakes. Maybe the principles of organizing could be marshaled not just to run a campaign, but to govern, to encourage participation and active citizenship among those who'd been left out, and to teach them not to trust their elected leaders, but to trust one another and themselves. That's what I told myself, but it wasn't the whole story. I was also struggling with narrower questions of my own ambitions. As much as I'd learned from organizing, I didn't have much to show for it in terms of concrete accomplishments. Even my mother, the woman who'd always marched to a different drummer, worried about me. "I don't know, Bear," she told me one Christmas. "You can spend a lifetime working outside institutions, but you might get more done trying to change those institutions from the inside. Plus, take it from me," she said with a rueful laugh, "being broke is overrated." And so it was that in the fall of 1988, I took my ambitions to a place where ambition hardly stood out. Valedictorians, student body presidents, Latin scholars, debate champions. The people I found at Harvard Law School were generally impressive young men and women who, unlike me, had grown up with the justifiable conviction that they were destined to lead lives of consequence. That I ended up doing well there, I attribute mostly to the fact that I was a few years older than my classmates, whereas many felt burdened by the workload. For me, days spent in the library, or better yet, on the couch of my off-campus apartment, a ball game on with the sound muted, felt like an absolute luxury after 3 years of organizing community meetings and knocking on doors in the cold. There was also this. The study of law, it turned out, wasn't so different from what I'd done during my years of solitary musing on civic questions. What principles should govern the relationship between the individual and society, and how far did our obligations to others extend? How much should the government regulate the market? How does social change happen? And how can rules ensure that everybody has a voice? I couldn't get enough of this stuff. I love the back and forth, especially with the more conservative students, who, despite our disagreements, seemed to appreciate the fact that I took their arguments seriously. In classroom discussions, my hand kept shooting up, earning me some well-deserved eye rolls. I couldn't help it. It was as if, after years of locking myself away with a strange obsession, like juggling, say, or sword swallowing, I now find myself in circus school. Enthusiasm makes up for a host of deficiencies, I tell my daughters. And at least that was true for me at Harvard. In my second year, I was elected the first black head of the Law Review, which generated a bit of national press. I signed a contract to write a book, job offers arrived from around the country, and it was assumed that my path was now charted, just as it had been for my predecessors at the Law Review. I'd clerk for a Supreme Court justice, work for a top law firm, or the office of the United States. Or the office of the United States Attorney. And when the time was right, I could, if I wanted to, try my hand at politics. It was heady stuff. The only person who questioned this smooth path of ascent seemed to be me. It had come too quickly. The big salaries being dangled, the attention. It felt like a trap. Luckily, I had time to consider my next move. And anyway, the most important decision ahead would end up having nothing to do with law. And that's chapter 1. And the first 3 words of chapter 2 are Michelle LaVaughn Robinson. Oh, this book is going to be a great read. Oh, and we have some photos here too. Cool. I'll show you guys some of these. Let's see if we can. I think that's his grandparents. His mom. It was him as a kid. No, yeah, maternal grandparents up here. I think this is. That might be his mom. He and his mom, or he and his grandma. I think, yeah, depending on how old she was. And then here's Barack, and it says, "I'm clearly proud of my swing." Yeah, great. Well, that was fun. And so if you guys haven't picked up this book, yeah, go over to Amazon and grab a copy of it. That's what I'm going to be doing with my weekend, is spending that reading. So, well, that was fun. I hope you guys enjoyed that. Yeah, we've been streaming we took the 20-minute Kayleigh McEnany press briefing and turned it into a 2-hour-long stream. So, yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope you guys liked the read. And yeah, go pick up a copy of A Promised Land. I'm going to go try to get a workout in, and then I'll be back a little later with some more videos and whatnot. So, see you guys.